Hey folks, and welcome into another episode. My name is Dr. Luke Hobson. I'm an instructional designer for MIT, a blogger, a podcaster, and the founder of Instructional Design Institute. My purpose is to help you make the online learning experience come alive for you and for your students. Today's episode, though, is all about you and trying to find the right instructional design job. I've lost track with how many conversations I've had with folks on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and email about how exactly do you land an instructional design job. Now, I know a thing or two about a thing or two, but I am not the expert in this, and I wanted to find someone who can explain more about this interviewing and hiring process. Luckily for me, and now luckily for all of us, my friend and colleague, Dr. Nicole Papaioannou Lugara from YourInstructionalDesigner.com wrote a fantastic blog post called 7 Lessons from an ID Hiring Manager for Anyone Looking for ID Work. This blog post was great advice for anyone really just wondering about what the ID interview experience is like. So whether you are brand new to instructional design or you're a senior ID looking for your next opportunity, this episode is for you. Speaking of which, if you are an instructional designer in higher ed looking for your next professional development opportunity, come check out Instructional Design Institute. This institute is filled with a nerdy community and the right content to help you take your courses to the next level. Lessons inside of here include universal design for learning, scenario-based learning, designing podcasts for courses, working with SMEs, and more. Included in the Institute's membership are live Q&A calls and webinars that I also record. Those are brand new. Just started doing webinars, and it's been a ton of fun. Really, this is a place for learning nerds to come together and learn how to make their online courses, their online learning experiences even better. Check out the link in the show notes to learn more, and of course, don't forget to sign up for the free trial just to see if really this is right for you. All right, folks, let's dive into this episode, shall we? Here is the one and only Dr. Nicole Papaioannou Lugara. Well, Nicole, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me today, Luke. Super excited.
Absolutely. I think I might be more excited, though, because I've been wanting you to have to come onto the show now for months and months. And then after your latest blog post, though, I saw that. I shared it in 3 seconds because I was just like, yes, now she can come on the podcast because we need to talk about this and to break this down because it is so meaningful for today in 2020 and people trying to transition over into the instructional design world. But before I get ahead of myself, can you please introduce yourself, talk a little bit more about your background and what it is that you do?
Sure. So, like you said, I think my name is Nicole Papaioannou Lugara, and most people can't pronounce any of that. So we just go with Your Instructional Designer, which is my brand name and also the agency under which I operate all of my freelance work. So for the past 7+ years, I've been working in corporate instructional design after leaving academia behind. And I also teach developing instructional designers through the Upskill experience, which is the learning platform side of Your Instructional Designer.
Fantastic. So, like I was saying, now I can dive into the blog post. So, now, absolutely, once again, I love your domain name. That is just so amazing. I just think about it, and it's just, once again, it's an absolute perfect domain name for what it is that you do. So, with this blog post, which is called 7 Lessons from an ID Hiring Manager for Anyone Looking for Instructional Design Work. That's when I was just like, I gotta ping Nicole. We need to talk about this because your opinion, it's so different and it makes it so valuable because you are an instructional designer. You have worked in academia. You have worked in private. You are a freelance. You've done so many different things in these fields. And then, of course, on top of this, you also were a hiring manager for instructional designers. So you have this insane background to complement everything we're going to be going into. So first things first, I want to know, what was your inspiration behind writing this blog post?
That's a great question. And I think it was just a Tuesday night and my blog was due Wednesday. And I said, a lot of people are talking about getting hired right now. Maybe I should help them out because I did this once. So that was really the beginning of it.
I and I'm laughing too because like I relate. I totally understand. Like, all right, I have a podcast coming out on a Tuesday. I need to follow up with an email on the Wednesday, and I got to do it's the schedules, and this is what we were talking about beforehand too. Is that I think 2020 has just made it so that like we're just working constantly because the brain can't shut off anymore because there is just so much to talk about with instructional design nowadays. You can't avoid it. And I'm finding now that like I'm just reading instructional design things for fun. Like I don't know when that change happened, but it went from like, oh, this is only about getting better at professional development. And now I'm like, ooh, what are we talking about today? So it's been a weird shift. So so let's dive on into these because you have 7 tips in total, and I would just love to go down the list, expand and talk about each one. So for the very first one, of course, the essential, we need to talk about learning. And as instructional designers, learning is clearly core to our purpose. It's what we do, it's what we know. How should potential instructional designers prepare for interview questions all about learning?
I think, and in the blog post it says it, but I like to think of it as like a statement of learning philosophy. And it's something I had to do when I was studying for my doctoral degree. But just being able to articulate, who's influenced your view about how, learning design and learning should work, that's important. And just, it doesn't have to be like a specific title or theory, but you have to be able to articulate this is what I think education or learning should look like when it's done right. And so this is the lens through which I design everything. And helping your hiring manager or interviewer kind of get that feel will help them decide if you're the right person for their organization.
So, how far should someone dive into this? Like, if I'm talking about just going granular, and I'm a candidate looking to, to go into this field, are you looking for someone to just explain about like general concepts of just how people learn, or is it kind of a bonus if I'm able to go through like a Bloom's taxonomy or some other type of framework?
Yeah, I don't know that you need to have the exact name dropping titles. I think it's really helpful. And honestly, it'll, depending on who you're talking to, might give you a little boost in their opinion, especially if there's someone who's not familiar with the field and they're like, oh, this person knows all their theorists. But I think if you can just articulate like the 2 or 3 key things that you just find essential about learning, for me, it's always that you can transfer it beyond the context that you're learning it in. Right. So that doesn't need a fancy title. I just need to be able to tell people that. So if you can do that in a few sentences, your statement of learning philosophy elevator pitch, you can call it, I think that's really good.
Now, do you remember your first interview question on learning, like when you were trying to become an instructional designer?
I wish I did. I don't. It was so long ago. But I do know that I was lucky enough I was being interviewed by a company that didn't really have an instructional design department, which we know is common. But they did have like a freelance instructional designer on staff who helped to interview me. So I do know they asked about, what theories. One of the first questions I believe was about like what instructional design theories I like or use.
Oh, okay. Well, that's realistic. Yeah. That's a good question.
I was studying that weekend, so that's why I knew them.
There you go. Still fresh in the brain. My first learning question was literally on, this is like me trying to break into the field. I was an academic advisor at the time, and I'm trying to go into learning resources. And the question that my later on director, as I got the job, she just simply asked me, what is learning? And I'm like, okay, Michael, this is going to be a huge answer. But of course, like, I'm still learning myself. I'm like, I don't know the theories or anything. I managed to somehow give such a broad enough answer that she thought that I was talking about Vygotsky's theory. And she basically made it seem like I was way smarter than I was, where I was like, whoa, okay. Like, I did not go into that level of detail, but thank you for thinking that I know something about learning. But that was just such I was just so taken back by it because I'm like, oh yeah, I'm prepared to answer like this and this and this and this and this. No, general, what is learning? Oh, not ready for that one. So going down this list, going up to the next tip, you mentioned about being able to describe a process. And I think we both know that anyone can name drop. And I think unfortunately that's becoming more of a trend, is that people are looking at job postings and they're thinking about like, oh, okay, Addie, Sam, backwards design, there's a whole bunch that they can talk about. But as an instructional design hiring manager, what are you looking for as a candidate describes their process?
Yeah, so Addy, Sam, Agile, great to know, definitely useful, but I don't actually think that it tells me your process. It just tells me you know like an instructional design term. So I want to know, how do you handle getting information? How do you handle working with people who might not always be super available, SMEs? And how do you sort of manage your own project as you go through? That to me is way more important. That tells me you know what goes into developing learning, and it also tells me that you are able to manage yourself to some degree, because I don't want to be a micromanager.
Yeah, of course. And everything for instructional design really should come with being a project manager, relationship manager. Like, oh, yeah, all those need to. Oh, yeah. Everything needs to go into that because we wear just so many hats and it's just becoming. And now, as things keep on growing, I feel like our jobs are just expanding more and more to now, like, oh, you can take on this, you can go down this road. And you're like, okay, let me figure this out. Now, going off of that, I've seen some job postings recently that actually called out using one ID model over another. So I'm kind of curious on your perspective on this one. If they are actually saying and basically declaring in a job posting that you need to have an Addy background, does that like what does that actually mean as far as for like if I had a background in something else, is that going to hurt me? Is it transferable? Like what is this person thinking about?
Yeah, I totally think it's transferable. If you don't know the acronym, go read it and be ready to talk about it in your job. I mean, for the most part, all instructional design projects are going to require you to think about, how do you get the information you need to know to do the work? How do you design it so that it makes sense for the learning population and the task and the organization? What do you need to do to make the stuff? And then how do you deliver it and figure out if it worked out okay? So whether you describe that as Addie, as Sam, whether you think of it as linear, as something else, um, those components are always going to be in there. So I don't think it matters. I think if you want that job and the rest of it looks good, and you've been using Sam and they use Addie, just go learn what Addie is, figure out how your work has fit into that model, and talk about it.
It's really amazing when you boil down what it is that we do. You can talk about it just like that. Like, and it's perfectly true. Like there are very simplistic ways of thinking about it, and then you can go and look up something, and they might have a 3 hour video for you to watch all about like the fundamentals of Addy, and they're going through all these things, and it's like, give me just like a minute, and I could tell you how to do this. Like we don't need to have like you to write a dissertation on something that you shouldn't have to. As you mentioned, an elevator pitch. You should be able to give that elevator pitch. And if not, then I guarantee that the hiring manager is going to be like, okay, I've had enough. Like you talk too much. Yeah.
And especially since, like we were saying, most of the hiring managers there's a good chance they're not learning people. So if you spend, if they probably just pulled Addie out of a book somewhere because they saw instructional designer and that was like the next keyword. So if you spend 12 hours talking about it, it's not going to mean anything to them.
Have you talked to any recruiters lately for anything like with 2020 of them just like calling and saying like, hey, you interested in XYZ
Yeah.
project? So I've had those phone calls, and I'll take whatever phone call, right? And sometimes I'm talking to the person, and then like as we're just having like a casual conversation, I can tell literally what you just said. They have no idea what they're doing. They're doing their very best, but they just don't know. And I've had a few of those conversations where I was just like, hey, listen, I'm not the right guy for you, but like, do you want me to kind of just explain more about what it is you're talking about? Because I can already just tell the next couple of interviews you're going to do, the person's going to do the exact same thing. They're going to be like, what's going on? And I've had to just have some of these like heart to heart conversations with recruiters to being like, let me tell you about instructional design, because I can tell you're lost.
Well, thank you for doing that service for the rest of us in the industry.
I mean, just trying. I just feel bad because instructional design to many people is just so new, even though it's not new at all. But to many people, they're like, we've never had to hire for this type of position before. And you can just tell where you're like, ooh, let's just help out everyone else today in society. Cause yeah. So your next point is one that I've seen that's usually often overlooked, and I'm not sure if that's because folks are kind of afraid to talk about the statistics or whatnot. But really, it's diving into stats and showcasing your work. Can you explain more about this?
Yes. So, from the most basic storytelling perspective, if I'm looking really quickly at a resume, the easiest thing for me to do is to look for numbers. They'll stand out from all the words. So, if you can quantify your results, it instantly will tell me a much stronger and more easily accessible story. So, like your resume just kind of rises to the top because it's been easier for me to read. But also in business, people are looking for real impact. So, if you can again, quantify the work that you've done. If you can give me percentages or statistics or at least case studies that show me that you are doing more than a task, that you're really creating impact, then awesome. Then I'm like, oh, this person, they know what they're doing and they can help me. And I think a lot of people, and this is something I learned when I was writing resumes too, we stick to those tasks. We just say like, oh, I designed learning, I wore many hats, whatever you did, but you don't tell me what you created for that business. You don't tell me about the impact.
No, why do you think that is?
I think it's because it takes a little bit of extra thought. And sometimes people don't realize they have the data, right? So I joke that, like, also the numbers. You could say I had a podcast that had 4 listeners and I then grew it to 10 listeners. And that is, if I'm just adding percentages, I'm going to do terrible math now. Right? I grew it like over 50%, right? If I grew my podcast over 50% on my resume, that looks amazing and no one knows it's just from 4 to 8. So just finding little things like that, even if you're a teacher, right? Saying I taught English is really different from saying I led over 800 students over 12 years to successfully develop skills in the English language. And it's the same exact thing, but one is an impact statement and one is just a task. And it might just be a little harder for you to think about what are the numbers, but just do that little extra work because it's going to put you closer to the top of the pile.
I know for sure it absolutely has. And I know that when I was rewriting my resume, which I try to go back and I really should do this a lot more, but of course she's kind of, yeah, right. Exactly. She's like, yeah, me too. But when I think about it and exact same thing you were saying is that it was harder to do. And I know that when I was thinking about a certain project, I wasn't thinking about the number of people it had an impact on. So I developed online learning communities. That was inside of there. What I did not put in, like, on top of that was the fact that this was the only online learning community platform for the school at the time. And there were 60,000 students who used it.
Wow.
Right, exactly. So it just went from me saying like, hey, I just make a couple of LinkedIn groups to all of a sudden just like, hey, every student at this school is trying to access this in the undergraduate program. So like that just has so much more of an impact compared to exactly what you were talking about too. Because I think that people just default back to wanting to use more like a qualitative, like they want to like tell a story, but you can only have so many words until like it just kind of starts to blur on the resume and it doesn't stick out.
And honestly, everyone's going to be telling, theoretically, if you're applying for a job, right? Everyone has a similar story to some degree. So those little impact statements really make you stand out because nobody is going to have that exact experience.
Exactly. I still love your tip too about the 50% thing. That's just been
It's the number that works better, right? 4 to 8, not impressive. 50% impressive.
Yeah,
I guess
exactly.
it's not even 50%. It's 200%. I'm terrible at math.
You're also talking to someone who's really bad at math. So
She is in English. I'm just going to state that.
My background's in graphic design. not meant to do this. No.
Yeah. So I know everyone else listening was like, no, that math is totally wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a few comments. No, it's fine, people. This is the real world. It's already happened too, where my screen has frozen randomly during this interview, and I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? So you know what? This is 2020. we're just riding with it just like everyone else right now in our field. So it is what it is. So going to your next tip, which is on speaking to the needs of a company and showcasing how you could be a good fit. I love this one. And I really want to talk about this one. How would you recommend doing this if there isn't that much information specifically about the department that you're applying for, like publicly available?
Yeah, so obviously, if it's publicly available, go straight up internet stalker, like look up everything. If it's not, then I would say read that job description really closely. That's like your golden ticket, right? If they're looking for someone who's really analytical, you're going to start to see that in the way they describe the tasks, even though they're talking about instructional design work. If they're looking for a graphic design, specialist, you're going to start to see that in the job description. And so you don't want to speak to a general instructional design position, right? Like that's like when people put objective to obtain a job in instructional design at the top of their resume. Don't do that. But also, it doesn't tell me that you've actually considered the things that we need in our organization. So if you can be specific, again, bonus points if you can find the organization, think about their mission, think about the things that are important to them. But if you can't, at least make sure you figured out what they really want from that job description.
And that was the reason why I asked about that being hidden away, because I think the default, I would hope, for most folks is to go into the website, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever, and look at everything. And then it's always kind of interesting how sometimes you can find like the learning and development department and sometimes you can't.
Mhm.
It's just like they're obviously core and central to the organization, but it's not always that easy to find more about them. And then come to find out that, like, you'll find this massive organization and they have a team of like two people. You're like, oh no.
And honestly, even the biggest organizations I worked with, uh, they don't have that many people on them.
No, there's one in particular I'm actually thinking about, and I said two. Really, there's one. There's only her, and she is it for so many people that when she told me that, I was like, that's not okay. Like, how are you literally being like this amazing superhero to thousands of people who need training and education? And it was nuts. Like, it's just like, I can't imagine doing so. So I don't know. So
I want to say really quick, also, as you're reading that job description, because what you just said, remind, make sure you're not going to be the one person at like a 5,000 person organization wearing 8,000 hats, because it's not sustainable. You're not going to be happy there long term.
Oh no, there's no way. And you're going to be asked to do things that are definitely not instructional design related.
Yes.
You'll be the whatever. And it's actually kind of goes back to the episode that we had with Heidi Kirby talking about the differences between corporate instructional design and higher education instructional design. And it actually can be the same thing. Hopefully not, but it can be the thing where you are just the sole person within the school or within the company, and you are expected to do literally everything, even if it doesn't apply to learning or anything else.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And
And you
it's
don't want to
just
be that person.
no, you do not want to be that person who's randomly told they're going to be doing workshops and all this other stuff. And you're like, that's not in my job description, but let's try and hope that that people like this. So, no, I get it. So, your next tip makes a ton of sense with having someone help you to prepare for the interview. And I feel like a lot of people don't do this. They just go in and wing it. And of course, you need to stand out from the crowd, and preparing for it is obviously one way to show how much you care. So, how should someone do this of actually properly preparing to go through these interviews, or mocking up with someone or hiring someone? What's the way to do this?
Yeah, I think to the best of your ability, try to figure out what you think somebody who's going to interview you would ask. And that might be by asking other people in the field what they've been asked before. That might be researching the company and figuring out what's important to them, what's on that job description. There's all of that preparation you can do. But honestly, if you just have someone role play it with you, someone you trust not to be totally ridiculous, it can be really helpful, because for most of us, it's the thinking on our toes part that gets us. It's not that we don't know the information, it's that we're nervous about being able to like shoot out information on demand. And the other part of that is just feeling more comfortable, right? So even forget the answers, just like feeling more comfortable and at ease, knowing that you've done it before. That really helps.
And then the more you actually say it and speak about it out loud too, you're going to remember.
Yes.
That's part of learning. It's a really shocking thing. The more you practice something, it's actually going to stick. Like, oh, what a weird concept. One thing that I found too, and I'm not sure if you've also done this for trying to find the interview questions for companies, I found that some of them are actually publicly available of people who have gone through past interviews. So if you go and actually look up a company on, say, Glassdoor,
Right,
and
right, yeah.
and Glassdoor will have, and of course, like, you need to take that looking through the lens of somebody who potentially did or did not get the job. So of course, be wary of different things like that nature too. But for some of them, I've read them and I was like, yeah, those are solid instructional design questions that you can absolutely practice and prepare for.
That's great. I have not done that one myself, but everyone should mark that down as a good tip.
I was going to say, do you have any other websites to go to? That's the only one I've found so far that has had this type of like a review of the actual interview process. And then if you go down the rabbit hole enough, you can search by department, by the job title, and then eventually you can get to talking about what it is. And they even actually rate how the interview went. So they give you the pros and cons of like not only the questions, but like even the interviewer. And yeah, it gets really interesting. So
I didn't know they do that. I just knew the employer reviews. So that's good to know.
yeah.
The only one that I would say, so I was on the fence, I guess, about being a freelancer for 5 minutes, and I decided to do a job interview at a university. And we had to do a panel interview, and that was nothing like any of the interviews that I'm describing. But that was like really strange because what they do on a panel interview, maybe you've done them before, but they gave me all of the questions when I walked in. I got to write all of my thoughts out, and then they went around the room, and there were, I believe, 6 people, and they would each ask me a question, and they were not allowed to respond in any way. And then they would go on and ask the next question. So I basically gave like a little speech. There was no back and forth. It was really weird. I can't say I enjoyed the experience, but if you're applying for a academic instructional job, that might be something you come across.
Unfortunately, yes. Like I've had a similar instance too, where same thing. I applied for a role, and then there was a same thing for academic jobs. There's always multiple rounds, and this was on. I had a panel interview as well, third round type of a deal, and same thing. I got the questions prepared ahead of time. I was asked to make an entire module on a certain topic. Could be anything that I wanted to do, and I did fantasy football. So it's
Really?
like trying. I know football. I'm like, let me tell you and break this down. And of course, like in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm doing great. I found an ebook by Matthew Barry, who is this like the inventor of fantasy football. And I had like all these different graphics and stuff. I was like, oh, I'm going to kill this. And that was my same experience. It was a panel back when we actually could go and meet in person when that was a thing. And there was a ton of people in the room, and one question went up. I answered the question, and everyone just either nodded or then looked at the next person to ask the next follow-up question. And I remember sitting there being like, I can't tell if I'm doing great. Am I doing great or awful? Like, please give me a sign.
My presentation, they asked me to do something similar, right? To create a learning experience. And my learning experiences are almost always interactive, whether it's online or I'm teaching something. So I'm asking them questions and they're just looking at me. Like they can't respond. It totally sucked all of the life out of the presentation. It's horrible. But
Yeah.
I guess that's the way it's done in some places. And just know that that could be a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Oh, hence why we should be preparing, because you should be preparing for anything. Unfortunately, you might have a panel interview. I know of someone who just had a panel interview via Zoom, and yeah, I know it's like I am so sorry. She did great, so hats off to her. Super proud of her, but woof, that is tough. I can't imagine trying to do that and actually look at everyone too as you're going and trying to make eye contact and just, that's really rough for everything. But no, most academic interviews are much more about, like you were saying, talking about the learning experience and describing it, and all those different types of good things, of relating everything back to transferable skills, the real world, how's this going to benefit the students, things that they should be talking about. So hopefully, if you can prepare ahead of time for interview questions around those, it will make sense as you go and describe your course. And if not, then maybe it's not the right fit, which is entirely possible.
Yes.
So
I wanted the job after I did the interview either.
Yeah, that's really the thing that I think we keep on going back to is that you need to figure out where your place is in all of this. And if it's not for you, and if you're not going to potentially treat you right or to help you grow, I think that's like the big thing too about like what is next afterwards when you're thinking about 6 months down the road. If I get this job a year from now, 2 years from now, are you going to hit a ceiling? And it seems like for most of these jobs, you might, and you might not know your next step, and maybe it will come in time, and there will be other different things. But it's entirely possible in this very wacky economy that like you could just be stuck somewhere, and then you're going to have to figure out where do you go next to get that experience if your employer can't help you get there. That is the real world. You also talked to before about hiring someone for this. How would someone go about doing that?
You mean like finding an instructional designer?
Yeah, like you mentioned before about like trying to hire someone who actually knows what they're talking about to make sure that you have like adequate adequately prepared for this. Let's say you go on Glassdoor, there's nothing there. You ask your friends, they ask you some ridiculous questions that just don't make sense, and they don't know about instructional design. So you're like, I'm going to hire a professional. How would someone like go about doing that?
Got it. There's a ton of people in our field. Maybe ton is over exaggerating, but there's a good number of people in our field who do coaching. And so if you want to pay someone for their time, they'll gladly help you. There are some people who are just very kind, and if you ask them nicely, they will also, help you out. And so I would say do what you're comfortable with. I mean, some people, like I'm really sensitive about my time. So like I'm almost more comfortable paying a coach. But if you're a grad student and you just left and, you know, fine and you don't have the money, just like ask. What's the worst they can say is no.
No, yeah, that's the worst they can say. Well, I asked too because I've talked to quite a few people now who like they're definitely getting frustrated with not hearing feedback. Like, they will go through the entire thing, they'll make it to the second round, third round, and then it's just like poof, cold silence, and you get back the traditional auto email response saying like, "Oh, we're so sorry, we found a better candidate," and then you're left to wonder like, "Well, what's wrong with me?" Basically, is like the feeling of rejection there. And maybe it makes sense to go out to find a professional and to reiterate and talk about those same questions and answers and just say like, did I do the right thing? In your opinion, if you were hiring for an ID, like, does what I actually say make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm all about going beyond yourself. I think that we are too far in our own perspectives to really see what we could be doing better a lot of the time anyway, and I just want to come back to what you said. There's usually nothing wrong with you if you didn't get the job. It's just that someone else happened to have like this big shiny thing that they were looking for. And that doesn't mean you don't have something. It just means they had whatever it was at the moment. Like and you can totally not know what that is, and the recruiter could come back to you and say there's no feedback, and it could be genuine. They could have thought you were awesome and you just weren't the person. That just happens.
It does. I've been a part of a few interviews, and sometimes that really is the worst. By the way, when you have two amazing people, and then just person A just beats out person B because of experience, expertise. They're a better fit for the culture, whatever it is, and you're like, but I love this other person. Like, why can't I hire both?
We're gonna need them eventually.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's what you always say. You're like, please stay in touch, like, strongly hinting, like, make sure we stay in touch. Hint, hint, if something comes up.
So when I worked at the other company where I was the manager for the department, one of the people I interviewed, we didn't hire at the time because when we did have a director for 5 minutes, they thought this person was too inexperienced. They'd only been like a TA. And then a few months later, when the director left and I was pretend director, I don't know, I was doing all the work. I was like, no, this person was awesome. And we called that person back in, and they wound up being like one of the best hires. I mean, hands down, impressed everybody, had a great work ethic. And he actually, I guess I've now said he, but he left the job he was doing to come work for me, which
Oh, cool.
was flooring to me. But yeah, I mean, he couldn't have had any inkling at the time when we told him, sorry, like somebody else had more experience, that we were going to call him back in 4 or 5 months. So keep it positive as long as they're not jerks,
No, of course. It's a common story too. I feel like that happens a lot. So, yeah, try to keep an open mind, even though I know it's so hard that getting that rejection email just makes you just want to just shut the laptop down forever and be like, nope, that's it. Gonna do something else in my life. So, no, I understand. Well, the next tip on here, we really don't need to talk about, but it's good to say is to show up on time.
Yeah, I mean, things happen, obviously, but to the best of your ability, do it.
Yeah, and I'm always impressed too when people show up to, and this is just me. I'm always impressed when people show up to Zoom meetings early because like you get the notification that like someone's already in, like they're waiting for you, whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Even though I know that the madness of 2020 has made all of our calendars have literally no breaks in between Zoom meetings. That's just it is what it is now. So I understand. There was another meeting I was in, and it ended like 30 seconds early from another meeting, and I literally sprinted to my kitchen to grab coffee and like ran back without trying to spill said coffee. And that's just what I feel like it is nowadays. So I know that most folks are like really understanding with timing right now because it's just different.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But if it's a matter of like you're not in back-to-back Zoom meetings, just
Yes.
set your alarm clock or whatever you need to do to show up on time.
Mhm. Exactly. Exactly. I try to set alarms on phone, laptop, and like everything else just in case. Do not forget about said thing. So that's my little tip right there on that one. And then finally, let's go into the last one, which might be the most important one of them all, which is being able to ask questions back to the interviewer. What are some amazing examples of questions that you would ask back to them to learn more about the job and the organization?
I have to say that this part's really important, like you said, because this is what will tell you if you want to work there or not. And I just want everyone to remember they are looking for talent. They need what you have to offer. So don't go in like desperate for the job, even if you're desperate for the job. It happens. We need money sometimes, but like remember that you are talent and you are interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. And so for me, as an instructional designer, I would definitely want to know things about their process, their workflow. Is it chaos all the time? Do they meet their deadlines? How did the handoffs get made? Is there a project manager? Am I solo? Like all of those things about process are really important, and they will give you some insight as to whether you are going to be working a nice, cozy 9 to 5 or like 8 to midnight, So I think that one's really important. I would ask them about their philosophy of learning also, because there are definitely really different ways of thinking about how we teach people. And if you're someone who doesn't believe in online learning at all, for example, I don't think there's too many of us out there, but if you didn't, then you probably don't want to go to an organization where they want to put everything online, right? Common sense, but you want to make sure you ask about these things. Other questions that I would definitely ask about who your manager will be and what their management style is like. I think that's really important. You might not get an honest answer, but you should try asking it anyway. Right. So those are the things you want to uncover. Basically, what's the work environment like? And the other one, what are the expectations that you have for me within the first 6 months? Because one, it'll tell you if they have expectations for you, which are kind of important. And a good manager will have some expectations for you so that you're both on the same page. But it's also just going to give you an idea of what you need to bring to the table and what you need to accomplish.
I think that's my favorite question of yours is talking about like, how are you going to measure my success?
Yes, I would love to hear that.
Yes. Because that's just so crucial going back to the whole, am I going to hit my ceiling within a year from now? Like you're going to know, they're going to be able to, should be able to give you an accurate answer talking about, is it going to be from the courses to the feedback to the, whatever it is around the organization that's going to determine, are you actually doing a great job or are things kind of, you need to figure it out. I love when you ask questions back and they, so you're saying like you might not get the honest answer, but their facial expressions will give it away. And that's the best. I can't remember what question I asked before in an interview, but we talked about something around like, are the instructional designers oh gosh, what was the question? It was something along the lines of like, are the instructional designers going to be like ranked at the bottom of this hierarchy where like professors are going to rule all, and unfortunately the IDs are going to be like kind of forced to do like, whatever has to be done. And like one person in the room was just like, oh no, no, we have a fair and balanced relationship. And the other person in the room was laughing. And I'm like, so like her facial expression tells me that things are bad here. And of course, and that's a significant part of the job. Like if you don't have the proper relationship balance and like, if you don't have the right say and it's just you're forced to do what might not be considered, a great type of a course or a good learning experience, then, do you really want to do that?
Question to ask. Definitely.
Absolutely. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for your time and going through all of these tips and everything for this sort, because everyone's going through this right now. It feels like at least everyone is currently going through this right now of transitioning over into the ID world. And many folks too, like we talked about all things for new to ID, but also this also applies to many people who want to transition from one instructional design field to another.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
corporate, higher ed, nonprofit, working at a government agency, there's always different things you need to be mindful of. So this can help out anybody. So if they want to know more about you, your work, and what it is that they do, where can they go to find you?
You can go to yourinstructionaldesigner.com, at Your Instructional Designer on Instagram, Nicole Papaioannou, PhD on LinkedIn, which you probably won't be able to spell. So just start with Your Instructional Designer stuff and you'll find me. And if you're really interested in taking some of my courses, I think right now only scripting voiceover for video is open, but upskillexperience.com is where all of that stuff lives.
Excellent. And I'm going to put the links for everything too. So you don't need to type it out. You can just go into the show notes and they can find it. But hey, either way, really good to know. Well, Nicole, thank you so much once again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Well, folks, I told you that episode was going to be awesome, and I'm pretty sure it delivered. There's so many good stories and pieces of advice and expertise all found within that entire podcast episode. I have to absolutely say, though, for first and foremost, thank you so much for Nicole for actually coming on to the show. And I have to give her a massive shout out because we had every interruption you can think of with this episode. My laptop, for some reason or another, randomly froze on me while we were talking, and I had no idea if things were still recording. And then right after that, like 10 minutes later, Amazon came to my house, dropped off a package, and my dog went nuts. He just lost his mind, of course, while it was still on the podcast episode, which luckily none of you folks heard. Thank you to the power of editing, and we still had an awesome conversation. We were still able to talk about everything, and really, I just hope you enjoyed it. And once again, Nicole, thank you for putting up with me, my shenanigans, and everything else that went into this episode. Be sure to connect with Nicole on all social media platforms, which I have linked for you in the show notes below. And you can read more about her blogs, including the one that we talked about today, and look into her courses on upskill by going over to yourinstructionaldesigner.com. If you did enjoy today's episode, please share it with your network on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, or whatever platform you're using. Everyone is currently applying for ID roles, and they need to hear this episode to provide some guidance and clarity on next steps on really just what to do. And as a mental reminder for you, if you are someone who has been getting shut down from job after job, I know it's an awful feeling. You start to doubt your abilities, you wonder if you're doing the right thing. And my last piece of advice for you is to not give up. Keep on working on your craft and try to get better every day, every week, every month. When I was trying to break into the ID field, I was turned down at least 7 times for going through multiple rounds of interviews with promising leads, hearing about signs that everything is going well, I'm probably going to get the job, and then, oh, hey, surprise, I didn't get it. So after going through that for so many times, eventually I basically quit and had to pick myself back up onto my feet and saying, like, you got to keep on going. You need to keep on pushing through. This is what you want to do, so don't give up. So that's my advice for you. Don't give up. You're awesome. I believe in you, and I know you can do this if you work hard enough at it. Once again, folks, you can find anything more about me, the show, or the Institute over at drlukehobson.com. Until next time, my friends, stay nerdy out there, and I'll talk to you later.